Newcomers to the Final Fantasy series often have trouble understanding the series. From the outside, seeing nearly 16 mainline entries, countless spin-offs, mobile games, and sequels can be a little overwhelming, especially when none of them seem to be related to each other. Finding a Final Fantasy that will resonate with you and evoke the feelings that fans have been professing for decades can be kind of hard on the first try. And the answer to embarking on this journey isn't as simple as starting with Final Fantasy Original. In this video, I hope to explain how this can be a negative aspect of the series, but just as importantly, one of its biggest strengths. But before we get started, this is my first video, so as a literal newborn baby channel, it would help greatly to get a like and a comment, and if you dig FF, please subscribe so I have more friends to talk to about my favorite game series. Also, this video will be spoiler-free for all FF games. So, what is Final Fantasy? A tough question for sure. What newcomers see at first glance is usually something like this. The logos and box arts are instantly iconic, and the visuals immediately scream high budget and quality. Even the stark all-caps lettering of the FF logo implies something of a timeless high fantasy epic, with a prestige that must speak for itself. I mean, look at this. There's nothing else on the market that looks and feels quite like the Final Fantasy series. From the many absolutely cracked FMV trailers, cutscenes, and tech demos shown over the years, it's clear that taking pride in presentation is a tentpole aspect of the series, much of which still holds up and makes some sick AMVs today. Needless to say, it's a unique style. I'm not going to go into the entire history of the FF series and Square Enix as a company here. There are many great videos that explain all of that. Check out Final Fantasy Union's video series on that. Here, I want to discuss the very thing in the title of the video. The one thing that I always say to new players or friends that want to check out what the series is all about is this. Final Fantasy is a tradition of change in almost every way. Sometimes for the better and sometimes not. So here's the basic rundown. Final Fantasy is a Japanese role-playing game series in which each and every entry into the mainline numbered series is a totally different world. And when I say different, I don't mean like new regions in Pokemon or Dragon Quest where they're all slightly related, taking place in different time periods or alternate worlds or something. In Final Fantasy, each world is a whole planet, built from the ground up for every game. Story and world building wise, almost nothing is reused. When creating each new entry, an immense amount of thought and consideration is put into making each world unique, and the story within it wholly its own. Cultures and creatures and technology built not for the world, but by the world, and how its physical laws work within the lore. I put it like this. In FF, the story can only happen within that world, because the world is the story. No generic fantasy lands to be found here, meaning each entry stands on its own as a snapshot of its time in gaming history, and a pinnacle of what Japanese game development was capable of at the time. Keeping each game self-contained this way allows them to go into each new project fresh with new ideas, and allows them to build upon the legacy the developers and their predecessors paved the way for. It also allows each game to tell a complete story, independent of other titles, while retaining the same brand recognition. Over the course of over 16 titles, there's a lot of material here that just begs to be dove into. Starting off with very humble origins, the Western tabletop high fantasy D&D inspired title, Final Fantasy, was released to tremendous success. From there, Hironobu Sakaguchi, granddaddy of FF, wanted to continue to evolve what they could do with the JRPG systems they had developed. As early as this, a core design philosophy took hold. Each new game from here on would evolve the formula advance the art of their storytelling in some way. Small steps were made at first, advancements to the combat system, the not quite turn-based active time battle system, character progression, the job system were all revolutionary achievements for the JRPG genre. As we come around to FF4, the characters quickly started to have real personality, motives. They go through strife. We begin to gather ensemble casts with tons of interesting and diverse characters to adventure with. And the worlds, the locations, begin to inspire imagination beyond where much of Western fantasy typically dares to go. Many games take on a distinct sci-fi magitech fantasy setting, like 7, 10, 12, 13, while most of the earlier entries tiptoe in that area but stay decidedly high fantasy. So what ties all of them together? Besides the naming convention, you may get many answers from Final Fantasy fans. Many echoing elements like chocobos, summons, Moogles, dragoons, Nobuo Uematsu's absolutely incredible scores, even things like late-game story twists or giant world changes are prevalent in many of the titles. Once unique elements from a single game that have rolled up and stuck to FF like a giant Katamari Damacy ball, picking up new series staples with each entry. This keeps a certain soul of the series always intact, no matter the wild new settings we may inhabit or what cool new characters we may play as, or whether we're doing it turn-based or action style. Building off of what had come before and trying new ideas that, with time, become a part of this special, nostalgic identity of FF. One of the most fun things we do as Final Fantasy fans is anticipate how these elements will be imagined within each new game and world, and seeing them show up always makes it feel a little bit more like home. This balance of the new and the familiar has been the key to the series' success, but it has also been the cause of a lot of disappointment and contention in the fandom over the years. There are certain points in the company's history when it became clear that the focus was shifted towards graphical fidelity and being on the cutting edge of graphic technology in games and even in film. Let's be clear, for the time, they most certainly were on that edge, producing beautiful FMV work on Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts, which led to an era of pure, sublime, awe-inspiring fantasy. Much of which I still look back on fondly, as so much of this visual style affected me as a kid. This was my era of FF. This looked like nothing else at the time, and I was totally on board, even if it wasn't very popular among kids my age. You could just look at anything and know it was FF. That's how distinct the visuals were, and it definitely left an impact. But this visual focus led to some questionable moves in the late aughts, which nearly sunk the company a few times, disappointed fans, and changed the reputation of Square and Final Fantasy teams for years to come. Change and new approaches are risky business, but that's for another video. The Final Fantasy series is one of constant evolution. That's why so many fans stick with the series, even when an entry doesn't speak to them personally or just doesn't work at all. The hope, the promise of the next entry feeling like it was made just for you, that it'll provide a sublime feeling of being in another world, wholly unlike our own, where anything is possible, any task can be challenged, any setback can be overcome, and the fulfillment of your journey is only limited by your imagination. Final Fantasy as a series is about perseverance, learning from your mistakes and taking the best aspects of itself and yourself and changing them in hopes that it's for the better, which is reflected in the content of all of the games themselves. It's a series that has a long history of tradition and reverence, but at the heart of that celebrated esteem is a tradition of change. Recently, Final Fantasy has been on something of a winning streak, with the overwhelmingly positive reception of Final Fantasy VII Remake and FF14 critically and sales-wise, plus the highly anticipated Final Fantasy XVI coming next summer. It seems to be a period of renaissance for FF. Many new players and streamers have begun to pick up older titles with critical acclaim like Final Fantasy VI, 10, and 12, and the original 7. One of the most iconic JRPGs of all time, if not the most. These are excellent games if you love RPGs. Consider starting with one of those, or even the original 1, 2, and 3 if you're the kind of person who likes that era. All of which is to say that with so much quality content to catch up to and so much more on the horizon, now is an excellent time to be a Final Fantasy fan, and an even better time to start the journey to become one. So, pick a game, try it, just might like it. Thanks for watching, Warriors of Hype. If you like this video, please drop a like, leave a comment down below, let me know what your favorite Final Fantasy is and what games you haven't picked up yet that you're anticipating trying. Thanks for watching. Cosmic out.